So I received a message this week. It just said Galatians 4:16. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with that passage, but you'll get to see it today if you're not familiar with it. And I said, well, what happened? And the response was, it'd be a good lesson. So we'll find out if I can live up to that expectation. As I began to ponder that passage, Galatians 4:16, I could have approached it in a number of ways. I think sometimes, though, the best, and actually maybe one of my preferred methods, is really let's go back and if you want to understand what's going on in a specific verse, the best thing to do is to go back and just back up a few verses and then read on past, and you can get the full understanding of the context of what's going on. And so we're actually going to deal with Galatians chapter 4, specifically verses 11 through 20, as we get an understanding of Galatians 4:16. Now, before I start, let me ask a question as I begin to get your mindset here as to what's going on. How many of you have ever had to deal with an unfaithful Christian, either by trying to teach them truth or to go back and correct some type of a spiritual misunderstanding? I think probably quite a few of us have found ourselves in that type of a situation. And the same thing oftentimes would happen with those who are agnostics or atheists or have come out of some denominational group or attend community churches. And when you begin to oftentimes teach them truth, I hate to say it, but oftentimes people, they don't seem to receive it well. And so as we begin to think about this, and we're going to look at an example, one of the things we need to understand is how we feel and the reactions that we receive from others when we are correcting error. It really ought not to surprise us. And as a matter of fact, Paul dealt with a number of situations just like this, which we've addressed a few times. And as we go to the book of Galatians, we can learn by inspiration much that Paul has to teach us. Now, you may say, well, I'm not very familiar with Galatians 4. Before we get into this, it's really an exhortation by Paul for the Galatians to continue with Christ and to stay faithful to the gospel. And he then goes on and he's basically explaining to them how illogical it is for them to go back to Judaism, which is now a covenant made obsolete by the sacrifice of Christ. And as you look at Galatians chapter 4, as we find in many of Paul's writings, he is very plain and straightforward. Now, as we look here in a couple of passages, you're going to see a number of different emotions from Paul. You're going to see some anger, fear, disbelief, mistrust, and there's probably more we could list. And the emotions and the reactions that we have recorded for us, they're very honestly portrayed. They are reasonable, and I think they are logical. Now, before we go any further, let me point something out, and I'm going to do this for a reason. We live today in a very hypersensitive and often intolerant society, especially when it comes to truth. And to be honest, to be straightforward and honest with somebody isn't oftentimes received very well. But here's what I learned as I look at the book of Galatians. It doesn't look like it was any different in the first century. It seems like there were people in the first century that didn't want to receive or be told truth, and they didn't receive it well. And as we look at this, we notice he's unapologetic. He's just very straightforward and to the point, and he's just laying it out on the line. And why? Because there's souls at stake. And it's no different today than it was in the first century. Let's go ahead and pick up here in Galatians chapter 4, verse 11. We're going to go passage by passage until we get to the one that was requested, which was Galatians 4:16, and then we'll continue on. Notice what he says here, Galatians 4:11. He says, I am afraid of you, lest I have bestowed upon you labor in vain. Now, this isn't really translated the best in the English, and I think there's a little bit lost. Paul's not literally afraid of them, but he's actually afraid on behalf of them or for them. Guys, he's already told them in an expression of amazement and bewilderment at their apostasy. If we go back to Galatians 1:6, he says, I marvel that ye are so soon removed from him that called you into the grace of Christ unto another gospel. Guys, they are being led astray by false teachers who are combining portions of the law of Moses with the Christian faith, and they have created another gospel. Guys, that's happened today where people have taken portions of different faiths or just made up their own, and they've came in and they've changed the plain gospel. That's what's going on here with the Galatians. And Paul Paul's extremely concerned here. Because, guys, if they continue doing what they're doing, the result is they're going to fall from grace. Matter of fact, Paul's point is they're going to be lost. Listen to Galatians 5, 3, and 4. He says, "For I testify again to every man that is circumcised." Now, for those maybe who are not real familiar, the Jews were required to be circumcised on the 8th day. But you had these Judaizers who were then saying, well, if you want to be a Christian, you also have to be circumcised, okay? And so he's talking about this part of the Jewish law that people are trying to mandate and bind on Christians. He says, "For I testify again to every man that is circumcised that he's a debtor to the whole law." Let me pause for just a second. If you're going to do part of the Jewish faith, you need to do it all, right? If you were going to live as a Jew, you weren't allowed to pick and choose what you were going to do. You had to do all of it. And he's laying this out very logical. If you're going to do circumcision, you need to do all of it. He goes on. But remember, these are Christians. "Christ is become of no effect unto you. Whosoever you who are justified by the law," he's talking about the law of Moses, "ye are fallen from grace." You are trying to be justified through a covenant that's no longer even in existence due to the sacrifice of Christ. And he's saying if you continue to do this, you have fallen from grace. Now, he'll touch on this more. But Paul's afraid because he's worried that all of that labor that he spent in reaching the Galatians, it's going to be lost due to their departure from the faith. All the work, all the suffering, all the trial, probably the tears, all of that is being thrown away by these people who are willing to pervert the gospel. Now, there's a little bit of an application for us just from this passage alone. Guys, we need to be extremely fearful regarding the consequences of sin and apostasy, not only for ourselves, but for the people that we love, the people of the congregation here with us. And a proper fear of apostasy will cause us to be watchful. We could look at a number of examples, Acts 20:31, 1 Thessalonians 5:6. It'll cause us to have concern for the brethren within our congregation and the brethren as a whole. You'll hear a lot of people say, well, just be mindful of your congregation and only worry about... How many of you guys worry about the church as a whole? We should. A proper fear of apostasy also makes us zealous for the truth. Galatians 1:6, Philippians 1:17. Guys, if you're not worried about the truth, I'm going to tell you right now, there's a very, very unlikely chance that you're going to be faithful, and there's a very unlikely chance that you're going to actually try to help others be faithful. I can't get any more simple than that. You have to have a fear of apostasy, not only for yourself, but for others. Paul certainly does for this congregation. That's the whole point of him addressing the issue going on with the church in Galatia. Notice verse 12. Galatians 4, verse 12. "Brethren, I beseech you, be as I am, for I am as ye are. Ye have not injured me at all." All right, I'm going to break this down a little bit. The word beseech here actually implies an appeal with the expectation of compliance. What I'm saying is Paul, he's pleading with them to be in agreement and to be unified on this matter of the gospel. Which matter? The fact that you don't need to be circumcised to be a Christian. He's saying you guys need to be in alignment and agreement with me, and you need to be unified as a body regarding this. You don't need to be circumcised. And guys, why is Paul emphatic on this and passionate about this? It's a matter of salvation. We can't change the gospel or then go out and bind things that are not in the gospel, and that's what's taking place. This isn't just some indifference or a matter of opinion going on here. They are literally changing the gospel, and Paul's pleading with them and insisting that they change their minds. I didn't write this down in your notes, but guys, what comes to mind right now? James 5:19 through 20. He is trying to reconvert them, right? He's trying to convert the sinner from the error of their ways. He's trying to get them to be back in alignment with the actual gospel. And he's zealous about this because you guys have to remember, Paul was just like them. Notice he says, I beseech you, be as I am, for I am as ye are. Paul was once just like them. He had a wrong understanding about the will of God and what was required for salvation. Listen to Galatians 1:13. He says, "For ye have heard of my conversation in time past in the Jews' religion, how that beyond measure I persecuted the church of God and wasted it, and profited the Jews' religion above many my equals in mine own nation, being more exceedingly zealous of the traditions of my fathers. Paul, by experience, was actually aware of just how dangerous this situation is with the Galatians. They have been taught and are believing and actually doing damage by promoting and adhering to an altered gospel. But you have to remember, Paul didn't even initially believe in the gospel. Paul was persecuting the church. He was just as lost as they are. Guys, I think sometimes it's easier for those that have either come out of the denominational world or living in the world, or those who have gone wayward, to come back and to look at somebody who is not currently being faithful and to have a little bit of a sense of understanding. Sometimes there are those who have grown up in the church, and when they find someone who's unfaithful, their first thought is you know what, they're unfaithful, and they just write them off. But then you've got those sometimes that they themselves were unfaithful, or they themselves had been misled or mistaught, or they had fallen to the wickedness of sin, where they could come back and they could literally they could understand, they could kind of feel a little bit. I think that's the position we find Paul in. Paul knows their position. He had been in that position. And so, you notice here in verse 12, he says, "Ye have not injured me at all." That may seem like it's out of place. I think it's there because Paul really understands that there may be some type of an objection to what it is that he's writing here. They hadn't hurt Paul. As a matter of fact, when you go back and look, he recounts how he really doesn't have anything but good feelings for them because of their generosity and their kindness and their patience toward him. Listen to the very next passages, Galatians 4:13 and 14. "Ye know how that through infirmity of the flesh I preached the gospel unto you at the first." Let me pause before I go back. You may be saying, what's going on here? The Bible doesn't give me enough information, but it appears that when he first came to Galatia, there was some type of an illness that he had. I don't know if that's why he actually stopped there in Galatia, or he just happened when he got to Galatia, he was physically ill. That's what appears to be going on. Verse 14, "And my temptation which was in my flesh, ye despised not, nor rejected, but received me as an angel of God, even as Christ Jesus." Paul basically says, when I first got here, you guys were extremely open and you were warm towards me. You received me really even as if I was Christ himself. But I want you guys to notice the very next passage, because he asks this, where is then the blessedness ye spake of? For I bear you record that if it had been possible, ye would have plucked out your own eyes and have given them to me. What's he saying? What happened? What happened to you guys as compared to the first time I came here? They basically he says, you would have given me your own eyes. They had received the word from him as it was inspired, the word of God, and yet they've left the gospel for another gospel. So his question really is what happened to you guys? I mean, he's generally concerned about their souls, and certainly we need to take Paul's understanding and aspect here. We need to be this concerned for other people and for truth. And yet, for us to do that, our motives have to be really just as pure as Paul's are here. And we have to promote and show the exact same kind of, one, concern for others, but two, a steadfast for the faith. You don't see Paul wavering here, right? Paul's not giving the impression, hey, this false doctrine that you guys are bringing in and promoting, he's not giving the impression that he's okay with any of that. Now we get to the passage I was actually sent. Verse 16. He says, "Am I therefore become your enemy because I tell you the truth?" Here's what I thought of as I began to look at this. The one who truly loved them, the one who had taught them the gospel that was going to save their souls, he's generally confused and perplexed by the change in their attitude towards him. He can't understand why there's enmity and why there's jealous and why there's anger or hatred directed toward him when before, when he first came, there was such an outpouring of love and they received him really as Christ himself. Remember, they would have literally, he said, given me their eyes, but now it seems like they want to literally pluck his eyes out. Do you see the extreme? You would have been willing to give me your eyes, but now it seems almost the complete opposite. Let me ask you a question. How many of you guys have ever had somebody who once loved you, you were friends, you were very close, and all of a sudden their behavior changes towards you because you've either tried to address some type of a shortcoming in their life or you've tried to teach them some portion of the gospel that they don't agree with? Guys, there isn't any type of a rational explanation for their behavior. But do you guys realize that sinners don't oftentimes act rational? For those of you who are either wayward or came out of the denominational world, go back and think about your behavior and your thought process prior to becoming a Christian. I think back to before I was a Christian, my wife would say, "Why do you do this?" And I'd say, "I don't know." Is that rational? Is anything pertaining to the Bible, and you have no idea why you do what you do or why you believe what you believe, is any of that rational? It's not. And oftentimes sinners are not rational. Listen to Ephesians 4:17 and 18. Paul writes to the church in Ephesus, "This I say therefore, and testify in the Lord, that ye henceforth walk not as other Gentiles walk, in the vanity of their mind." Let me pause for just a second. Why do they walk this way? What is the vanity of their mind? What's he saying? Notice this. "Having the understanding darkened, being alienated from the life of God through the ignorance that is in them, because of the blindness of their heart." Most of us who were not raised up in the church, came out of the denominational world, or those who've become wayward, don't you have to admit that every bit of that is based on sheer ignorance? Initially, probably. It could be just an outright rejection, and sometimes that is the case, but it certainly is because of, as he said in Ephesians 4:18, blindness of the heart. Guys, error and sin oftentimes cause the mind to be darkened to the truth. And guys, in their mind, the declaration of truth causes them to view you as their enemy. And to be honest, in reality, guys, you are. Because you have sided with truth, but they have sided with error. And the dividing line is the standard of God, right? So when you go back and look at his statement there, "Am I therefore become your enemy because I tell you the truth?" Well, for those that want to do right, the answer would be no. But for those whose minds have been darkened, for those who do not want to do right, the answer is yes. Because the standard of righteousness is dividing them. He's standing on the truth, they're standing on error. So yes, at this point, they are enemies of God. They are enemies against one another. Why does it make us enemies? Well, it does make us not enemies only against other faithful Christians, but against God himself. Why? Well, let's notice just a couple of things. One, it exposes error for what it really is, and that's what Paul's doing here. Paul is flat out just exposing the error. Okay? Listen to John 3:19 and 20. "And this is the condemnation, that light is come into the world, and men loved darkness rather than light, because their deeds were evil. For everyone that doeth evil hateth the light, neither cometh to the light, lest his deed should be reproved." That's what Paul's doing right now. He is shedding light on this false doctrine of them mandating circumcision or any other portions of the law of Moses, right? And that is causing them to look at Paul as an enemy. Remember, the standard of righteousness is what's dividing them. Truth also requires men to change and forsake sin, Romans 6:1. It also destroys arrogance and pride of the sinners, Philippians 3, verses 1 through 8. And it humbles sinners, Matthew 5:3, also Matthew 11:29. Now, guys, let me say this, because most of us at some point will have to deal with somebody who's involved in sin or who believes error, and we really ought to expect them to act irrationally when they are confronted with this. Paul's not really taken by surprise here. I think he's more saddened, but the word he uses is marveled. He is marveled at their reaction toward him. One who loved him and accepted him so much at the beginning, who received the gospel from him, who basically now, in essence, have turned their back on him and really, in essence, view him as an enemy. You know, unfortunately, sometimes we are going to be saddened and sorrow because sinners will oppose the truth. Let me give you a couple quick examples before I move on. I'm going to go to Acts 7:51. Most of you are familiar. What a great sermon this is by Stephen. I'm just going to use one line here because he's right on the money. "Ye stiff-necked and uncircumcised in heart and ears, ye do always resist the Holy Spirit as your fathers did, so do ye. And some may say, are they really that bad? Well, let me fill you in. They killed him after this sermon. That's pretty bad, right? That's how bad these people are. He's right on the money. Listen to what Paul says in 2 Timothy 3:8. Now as Jannes and Jambres withstood Moses, so do these also resist the truth. Men of corrupt minds reprobate concerning the faith. Guys, this isn't anything new. You have always had those who have opposed the will of God. From the very beginning, this has been taking place. And so Paul should not really be surprised, and I don't think he probably is, but I think he's really saddened and he's disheartened. He has marveled that the ones he taught the gospel to could turn their back on him. The ones who had loved him and showed him that love basically look at him as an enemy. And you got to realize, and I'm sure Paul understood this, that they're not opposing us. They're opposing themselves, Acts 18:6 and 2 Timothy 2:25. They're not rejecting us. They're rejecting God, Romans 1:28. Let's go to Galatians 4:17 as we continue on. He says they, you may be wondering who's the they here. That's the Judaizers. They zealously, the Judaizers, affect you, but not well. Yea, they would exclude you that ye might affect them. All right, this is Paul doesn't always write in the smoothest way sometimes. I'm sure it came across better in the Greek than it does in the English. And this verse and the next one, verse 18, they're a little bit difficult. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to break these down basically section by section. Let's get an understanding of what he is saying here. He says, they zealously affect you. Now we're talking about the Judaizers, but for application, this would be for any false teacher that we deal with today. They want your allegiance to them, and they seek to have it by zealously seeming to have warm feelings for you. And let me point something out here. False teachers oftentimes appear to be the loving ones, and the ones with the truth appear to oftentimes be the hateful ones or the enemy. Why? Well, the ones without the truth, they're coming in and they seem so warm and so loving, and they seem like they really care for you. And then when you've got someone that comes up and says, now wait a minute, that is not right, stop, wait, hold right there, you come across as somebody who's very objectionable, somebody who maybe is very harsh in their words, somebody who's not very open to new ideas, new thoughts, and they come across as the loving ones, but you come across as really you're the troublemaker, right? These people, they want to zealously affect you. Guys, this is how congregations initially, this is how they're taken over. People come in and they zealously affect you. Oh, he's such a warm-hearted person. He's such a strong, dynamic speaker. And everything he says, it seems to make sense. I think of a couple guys around here teaching the 80-70 doctrine, one in particular. Seems very zealous, and he seems very intelligent, and he could, if you're not careful, he could swoon you over with good words, right? That's what these guys are doing. They appear to be the loving ones with the truth. And the ones who are saying, no, wait a minute, this isn't right, they come across as the ones who are the troublemakers. He says, they zealously affect you. Notice this, but not well. What's he saying? Their zealous attitudes that you're seeing, that's not motivated by good. They're not trying to help you. They're not seeking your best interests. That's not what's going on here. They seem like they are, but that's not what's taking place. He says, yea, they would exclude you. Their motivation is nothing more than to bring you into their false teachings and to separate you from Christ. And that's what they're doing here. They are literally changing the gospel. They're taking away the sacrifice that Jesus made on our behalf, and they're taking them back really into the law of Moses. Listen to Galatians 5:2. Paul says, behold, I, Paul, say unto you, that if ye be circumcised, Christ shall profit you nothing. What's he saying? If you guys go back into Judaism, you are going to be separated from Christ. You're going to be excluded from the benefits that Christ offered through his sacrifice on the cross. What is he trying to get us to understand here? They would exclude you. You see that right there in the King James. Exclude you from what? From the benefits of Christ. He died on the cross. You don't need to go back to the law of Moses. Galatians 5:11, Paul then says this, And I, brethren, if I yet preach circumcision, let me pause again. You may be saying, why would he say that? I think, this is my personal opinion, I can't confirm this. I think some of these Judaizers were saying, oh yeah, Paul teaches circumcision. Paul's teaching the same thing, right? And this is his response to that. And I, brethren, if I yet preach circumcision, why do I suffer persecution? What's he saying? I'm not out preaching circumcision like these Judaizers. I'm not doing that at all. Then is the offense of the cross ceased. If I was going out and preaching circumcision, why did we even need Jesus to die on the cross? And if you guys fall for this, you're going to be excluded from the benefits of Christ. Guys, he's laying this out just so logical. Verse 17, he goes on, that you might affect them. Guys, the goal of the Judaizers here, or really any false teacher, is to increase their standing with others by boasting of their accomplishments regarding you, while at the same time avoiding further persecution for Christ. And I'm going to have to explain this just a little bit, right? They don't want trouble regarding their false doctrine. They don't want to deal with persecution. And so what they want to do is really what these Judaizers have done. They want to come in, they want to teach their doctrine. They don't want to be bothered. They don't want to deal with persecution and or troubles. They simply want to get you to fall in alignment with what it is they're teaching, right? And they want you to accept it happily. Listen to Galatians 6:12 through 13. As many as desire to make a fair show in the flesh, they constrain you to be circumcised. Let me pause. Like the Jews were. Only lest they should suffer persecution for the cross of Christ. Let me pause. I'm going to keep going. They want you to be circumcised. Think about this. So that they won't suffer persecution for the cross of Christ. Who would be persecuting them? I'm going to answer that here in a second. This is what he's telling the church there in Galatia. For neither they themselves who are circumcised keep the law. Keeping the law of Moses is what we're talking about. They're not keeping the law of Moses, but they're trying to bind circumcision on you so they won't be persecuted. He says, but they desire to have you circumcised that they may glory in the flesh. They don't keep the law of Moses, but they want you to be circumcised so they don't deal with persecution. Who would persecute them? The Jews. The Jews who wouldn't fellowship or be anywhere near them because they weren't circumcised. They don't want to be persecuted for their Christian faith. So what can we do to make this easier? Well, we're surrounded by Jews. How about if we require circumcision as part of the faith? And that would probably, for the most part, deal with some of the dislike from the Jews to the Christians, right? Galatians 4:18, he goes on. But it is good to be zealously affected always in a good thing, and not only when I am present with you. What is he saying here? These Galatians should expect to be concerned about by Paul. They should expect Paul to be worried about them because Paul is the one who actually taught the gospel to them. What he's saying is you should expect me to care. I taught you the gospel and here you are forsaking it. Matter of fact, you're excluding yourself from Christ to go back into a covenant that is no longer in effect, that was replaced when Christ died on the cross. So yeah, you should expect me to care about this. Now, there are a number of other things that we could get from these two passages. But what do we learn primarily as we begin to look at this? One of the things I want to point out, and if you go back and you look at apostasy specifically within the churches of Christ, and you look at a number of those who brought apostasy in, the majority of them do it by teaching with flattering words, using a false appearance of love, and oftentimes they are very dynamic speakers. And they take all of those and they merge those together, and they come in and they do that, and their whole goal is that they can spread whatever wickedness and false doctrine they want. And it has come in and it has happened and it has destroyed congregations. And guys, it's happening to the church in Galatia. A church that was familiar personally with an apostle, and yet they have fallen for this. Let me point something else out. Let's think about the Judaizers there in the church there at Galatia. Guys, sometimes people who appear to love you, they don't really love you. And sometimes those people who come in and they act like they have your best interest at heart, they don't really have your best interest at heart. And these Judaizers may have seemed like they were really good people, really concerned about other souls. Paul's letting them know real quick, that's not true. In Proverbs 26:28 says, "A lying tongue hateth those that are afflicted by it, and a flattering mouth worketh ruin." What's he saying? Appearances can be deceiving. You guys ever had someone that you knew or you dealt with somebody? Well, not to put down car salesmen, but you ever go look at a car and find out that the car salesman, as nice as he seems, they always have a big smile on, and they're like, "Oh yeah, you couldn't get a better deal than this." And you find out, Lord, how can someone lie with a smile on their face? I think the Judaizers are doing this to the church to Galatia. Sometimes people who seem happy and seem to want your best interest don't really. Verse 19, "My little children," this is an interesting passage, guys. "My little children, of whom I travail in birth again until Christ be formed in you." Let me ask you a question. For all the mothers here, how many of you guys have ever travailed in agony multiple times for one birth? You don't, do you? You travail the one time when they're born. Paul makes a very interesting comment here. What's Paul saying? He's extremely worried about the outcome in Galatia. It's not looking good. Matter of fact, it looks really bad. And Paul had similar experiences with the Corinthians, 2 Corinthians 7:2 through 16. Also with the Colossians 2:1. Paul was more than just a father. Here he uses a very interesting phrase where he says he travails or he experiences birth pains for them as a mother. He had done this when they were initially converted and born again, and he is doing it now again. Notice this, he's going to continue to do it until Christ be formed in you. He is going to have these birth pains until they are matured in Christ and they're actually being faithful to the true gospel. So let me point something out here. No mother actually endures travailing of childbirth multiple times for the same child. But that's what Paul says he is doing here. He's literally having these consequences of their potential apostasy being magnified by the fact that he's saying, "I am travailing over and over again these birthing pains for you guys." They are in effect back at the very beginning. Just like when they first started, like when they were first born again and he was dealing with all the pains and bringing them to being born again, he's dealing with all that over again. Again, that makes me think again of James 5:19 through 20, of reconverting. When somebody has walked away from the faith, how do you convert somebody who's not a Christian yet? You have to sit down and have Bible studies. You have to get them to get an understanding of the gospel, right? So that they can obey the gospel. If somebody leaves the faith, how do you get them to come back to it? The same way. You have to reconvert them back to the truth, and sometimes that's harder than the first conversion. Paul says, "I am travailing in birth again until Christ be formed in you," until you're mature in the faith. He's got to literally be wondering, was it all for nothing? I'm going through it all again. I am reteaching them all again to bring them back to the true gospel that I already taught them once, and now they're leaving it. And I'm doing it all over again. And Paul basically says, I am willing to endure this over and over and over again. Do we look at our brethren that are in error like that? How much are we willing to endure to bring them back? I've known people personally who just said, "You know what? They're being unfaithful. I'm done with them. I'm done with them." Do you know how short the book of Galatians could be? Paul could have wrote, "You rank sinners, I'm done with you." But he doesn't. He says, "I am going to endure the pains of this birth over and over and over again in an attempt to get you to come back to being faithful." It is really sad to think that a congregation can get like this, but how many of you have seen it? We see it in the first century. It's happening today. Paul's trying to get us to understand how he feels about them. And he felt the same way with the Corinthians. 2 Corinthians 12:15, remember how messed up that congregation was? We act like all the congregations say, "Oh, there's so many congregations that are faithful and strong." They've all got problems. He says, and I will very gladly spend and be spent for you, though the more abundantly I love you, the less I be loved. The more I love you, it seems like the more you hate me. That is really sad to think that Paul could love congregations, could try to keep them on the right track, could try to continue to help them to grow and mature in the faith. And he says, the more I love you, it seems like the more you hate me. How many of you guys, as a parent, have ever had to deal with that? The more you try to love your children, it seems like the more they're despised by you. They don't want anything to do with you. And guys, I have to admit, when I was young, I thought my dad was so dumb. He just doesn't understand. And guess what I found out? All the things I didn't think he knew I was doing, yeah, he did them too. He was way ahead of me. Same thing with my mom, right? Paul had been there and he understood. We have to learn that the expectations of conversion, it's to create a new man, but it's to create a new man who will stay faithful according to the gospel and not go back to the world or not go into error, but that's what the Galatians are doing. So they weren't really converted. They've gone back into a false doctrine, basically, and Paul says, we're going to have to go through this all again. I'm going to have to deal with the birthing pains all over again. Verse 20. I desire to be present with you now and to change my voice. Guys, this is sad. For I stand in doubt of you. How'd you like to have an apostle write you a letter that says, not only do I know you guys have basically left the faith, I stand in doubt of you right now. It appears that he doesn't have any proof at this point that the Galatians are going to return to the faith. He doesn't know if they're going to come back and be faithful, for sure. And it appears that he's doubtful of them. Why? Well, we've touched on this before. What you believe, what you think, that affects every action, right? Your beliefs are going to guide what you're going to do. At this point, they're being taught and they believe, and many of them are actually carrying out, commanding and instituting circumcision as a part of the gospel. I don't know what else they've been taught, but I know that there were a number of teachings by the Judaizers. And what they are saying, basically, the result of bringing in Judaism or the Judaizers' doctrine is basically to say this: Christ's sacrifice on the cross, it was not sufficient. Logically, and if you infer, that is what that is saying. What I mean is if you're mandating some portions of the law of Moses, what you're saying is Christ's sacrifice was not sufficient. Or it infers that the teachings of the New Testament were either lacking, or they were inferior, or they were not binding. Now, guys, let's use that for just a second. You bring any error into the church, and let me repeat what I just said about circumcision. It infers that the inspired teachings of the New Testament are either lacking. You bring in something new into the church, you're basically saying the Scriptures were lacking. We need to add this, right? Or two, you're saying the Scriptures are inferior or imperfect, so you need to add to or change. Or you are saying they're not binding. The same thing we see taking place here with circumcision is the same thing for any error, any error brought into the churches of Christ. Anything that detracts from the sacrifice of Christ and the inspired gospel as to the means of justification attempts to invalidate the effects of both. Colossians 1:18, also Colossians 2, verses 8 through 10. And so Paul had gone back and he had reproved their error. He had rebuked the teachers, the Judaizers of this error. And now he has to rely upon the gospel to do its job, right? Paul is sending them an inspired letter. It's part of the gospel. He is going to lay it out on the line. What are their two options? They can either do it or they can choose not to do it. Paul, right now, has to rely on the Word, the inspired Word, to do its work. And I think Paul was a believer that the gospel could change people. He expects the inspired Word to have its place and to do its work. I'm going to go back and look at the account with Peter, Galatians chapter 2. I'm going to read verses 14 through 16. Paul says, "But when I saw that they walked not uprightly according to the truth of the gospel," notice this, he's going to stand face to face with Peter. I said unto Peter before them all, if thou being a Jew livest after the manner of Gentiles, and not as do the Jews, why compellest thou the Gentiles to live as do the Jews, who are Jews by nature and not sinners of the Gentiles, knowing that a man is not justified by the works of the law. Let me correct this for anybody watching this online. Not justified by the works of the law of Moses. We are justified by the works and the word of the New Testament, John 12:48, right? He is talking about the law of Moses here. Keep this in context. You have people all the time, we don't live under any law. That's what Paul says. He's talking about the law of Moses. We're talking about Judaizers here. Keep this in context. He says, you're not justified by the works of the law of Moses, and you're not, but by the faith of Jesus Christ. Even we have believed in Jesus Christ, that we might be justified by the faith of Christ. Notice that again. You're justified by the faith of Christ. What faith is that? That's our New Testament faith. It's the gospel. And not by the works of the law of Moses. Right? We do know that works are required. We can go over to the book of James and look at that. He's talking about the law of Moses. For by the works of the law, or the law of Moses, shall no flesh be justified. It can't be, because that system, that was nailed to the cross. When the system of Christ, the New Testament, came into effect, that old law was killed off. You couldn't be found faithful anymore as a Jew. So how does it make any sense to take circumcision from a system that's no longer even in effect and add it to the faith of Christ? It doesn't make any sense. Any more sense than to change anything else. To come in and to change the gospel in any way. Change the plan of salvation. Change the order of worship, the acts of worship. Any of that. Guys, Paul had confidence that his letter, although he stood in doubt of them, he had confidence that it was going to go back and the gospel would reach who it needed to reach. Right? When we go out and try to teach people, do you think for a second you're going to reach all of them? But it will reach those who are trying to be faithful to God, right? His word's going to do the work. How did Paul react to the Galatians' error? Well, really the same way that we should react to error. He was concerned about their salvation. That's the whole purpose of writing the letter. He appeals with an expectation of repentance. He expects that, although there's still some concern and doubt here. He expected, but he really couldn't understand their irrational treatment of him. Right? They were seriously looking at him as if he was an enemy. He then exposed their self-serving motives that we find from the Judaizers, which again would be representative of anybody bringing in false doctrine. And then he was anxious as he tries to go on and says, I'm willing to do whatever is necessary, really to travail in these birthing pains over and over and over again to bring repentance. And in the end, he was trusting in the power of the gospel to accomplish its purpose. Again, that's why he's sending this inspired letter to them. Guys, Paul is our example of how to deal with false doctrine and those deceived by it. He's also an example of patient reliance upon God's word to do its work. Although he was doubtful, I think he was confident that there were some who were going to receive that letter by inspiration and that they were going to correct the matter. Again, it's very sad when you try to correct or help somebody and they begin to look at you as if they're their enemy. Remember this, the dividing line is always the standard of God, and so if they do look at you that way, it's not you per se that they're objectionable to. It's the Word. I know that was a little bit on the shorter side. My concern would be for each of us here, one, that you've obeyed the gospel, and two, that if you have, that you're faithful. If you're here and you've not obeyed the gospel, it's not complicated. Let some of us sit down and study with you, just like we find in the book of Acts. Let us tell you about Jesus. He was the Messiah. He was the Redeemer. We want you to have faith and believe, Hebrews 11:6. We want you to have an understanding about the church that He established. We want you to understand about sin and the consequence of sin, Romans 3:23 and 6:23, so that you'll repent, Luke 13:3 and 5. We want you to confess Christ, Romans 10:9 and 10, and we want you to be immersed in water for the remission of sins. When you do that, we find that you will be added to the church by the Lord Himself, Acts 2, verse 47. I went through that very quickly, but I'd love to sit down and look at every one of those passages with you if you're not a Christian. If you are a Christian, begin to ask yourself, have you been faithful? Ask yourself, maybe you know somebody who's not been to church in a while, or who's not faithful, or maybe you know somebody who's never obeyed the gospel that you could reach out to. Pray that each of us would try to reach those people and not be bewildered when they look at us as if we're their enemy, but try to approach them with the same mindset of Paul, as in, probably I should just expect it, but I'm going to go through whatever it is that I can to get them to be in alignment with the gospel. If there's a way that we can help you or assist you in any way, you can come forward as we're led in a song of invitation.